There's just smoke in my eyes. Cause this ain't no job. Use a movie where the girl gets the guy.
I'll wait for 20 seconds after. You guys good to go? Yeah. Awesome. Missing steps on this side. I'm glad this is a virtual talk. There's no stairs. Well, welcome to the stream for those of us in the room and those of us on virtual. I'll move over to the lectern for you, sorry. Thanks for coming to this stream. We've just got some quick housekeeping issues. First of all, due to the time constraints with the virtual stream, which will cut off at the end of the allotted time, please make sure you put your questions through the app. I will moderate those and put them up at the end. Now we have Dave Lewis, who's the Global Advisory CISO from Duo Security, to talk to us about jetpacks and other nice historical things from the security industry. Thank you, Dave. Dave, you're up on screen. Great.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for being here this morning. I really do appreciate it, even though it's nighttime over here in Canada. Wish I could be with you. I really, really do, and hopefully we'll get to that some point real soon. So today I'm here to talk to you about, I was promised a jetpack. Back in the day, we had all sorts of different promises of all this different technology, flying cars and all the rest of it. And when we take that, we line it up with trust and security, it really is an interesting conversation to have on how we are establishing trust overall. Next slide, please. There we go. So I have been, okay, something wrong here. That's not me. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right, so I've been in security now for the better part of about 30 years. And along the lines, I've had all sorts of different roles, and I've learned a lot from all of this as I've been going through. Sorry, could I go to the next slide, please? There we go. Okay, so wait, that's the wrong picture again. All right, so could we go one more? There we go. Okay, good. Now we're talking. I've been doing security for about 30 years now, and I've had all sorts of different roles, from being a firewall admin right through to being a CISO for a power company, and all points in between. And I've made a lot of mistakes in my career, but it's been very interesting in what I have been able to learn. And one of the things I learned is that sometimes people that see themselves as rock stars really need to have a proper writer. Go to the next slide, please. And so in this particular case, the rock star being my cat Loki, who put on quite a show last year. He was really tired from hunting rabbits through the window all day, so he will not be joining us today. But oh well. If we could go to the next slide, please. So early on in, when I was a kid, back in the 1970s, in back of comic books, they would have these adverts that would say, if you send in your money, we'd send you these X-ray specs. And I was absolutely just thought this was the most amazing idea. I was 6. And so I figured out how to get an envelope and get the stamp and everything. And I wrote my address on it and sent it on to the company, and quite literally put a bunch of change in the envelope because I was absolutely wanted to have these X-ray specs. Imagine my disappointment when I got them and it was just a piece of cardboard with a hole in it. So right there, we had an erosion of trust right out of the gate. If we go to the next slide, please. And then as I got older, I thought, okay, this would be a really cool idea because, I watched Happy Days one too many times and Grease and all the rest of it. And I figured, a switchblade comb would be really, really kind of neat to have. So I sent away for that. And this time, my parents were good enough to help me by sending a check, a little less painful than sending a bunch of change. But when I got it, it did 1 comb, 2 comb, and it broke. And again, we had a further erosion of trust. So if we go to the next slide, please. So promises were made back then. We were told that we would be all living on the moon. We'd have jetpacks, we'd have flying cars. And it's really unfortunate that this was how things were built up, didn't really align with where we are today. And we seem to be, really content to deal with what we have as opposed to what we were promised. Next slide, please. And as a result, we tend to battle with ourselves about, how we're going to get things done and what is, the best way to get trust in an organization and build it from there. But we have to do better overall. Next slide, please. And I apologize to the person who's doing the slides. There's a lot of them. So we never have to do a much better job. And around the world, because of the state of where we are now, we are dealing with remote workers as far as the eye can see. There was a time where remote workers were seen as, a convenience, a nice to have, something to reward your employees with. And now it has become really an effective tool in order to make sure that business can continue. And as we transition back into the office, which, a great deal of that's happening in Australia now, we have to realize that we have to be able to have resilience built in, that we're prepared for this in the future. And we have to foster trust with our end users so that they understand how to do this in the future. They're very good at what they're very good at. They may be in finance, they may be in HR, whatever it happens to be, but they're not necessarily technically savvy. And we have to make sure that we are giving them tools to help democratize security. And that really does mean making it as easy as possible for them to do their jobs safely and securely, because, we didn't give them the jetpack, but we can give them the tools to make sure they get the job done. That being said, next slide, please. My coworker was good enough to point out that, yes, there are jetpacks now, but for some reason, my boss, Wendy Nather, who just got inducted into the Hall of Fame in UK, pointed out that, I can't expense one of those yet. I'll say yet. That's my go-to. All right, next slide, please. So tools of the trade. We want to look at how we can do things better. And, ways to authenticate users is a great example of this, because we tend to rely on some controls that are essentially deprecated, like the password. Now, the password has served its purpose since about 1962. It has really done its job. But so has the house key to get into the front of our abode. A house key has limited utility. The person who has it has the ability to access the house. It doesn't mean that's the right person that's supposed to be coming through the front door. So we have to be really cognizant of this, that when we're dealing with computer systems, that we understand that this is a bit of a misstep and we got to do a better job, be it multi-factor authentication, biometrics, or in the future, passwordless. There is an open standard called WebAuthn that was penned by the W3C, which is a great example of how we can get to passwordless. Is it the be all end all? No, but it's a great step forward. So if you take nothing else away from this talk today, besides visiting my colleagues in their booth today, make sure that you go find this document and read it. This is an open standard. This is not any sort of vendor thing. This is something that is freely available. So when we have the tools and we understand that there are better ways to do things, we have to also be aware that the attackers are looking for ways to cause trouble. Next slide, please. Thank you. So dark patterns in user interface design are one example of this. So when we're talking about that sort of thing, it's sort of how they manipulate the interface. So you go to click the X in the top right corner, which most people say, oh, that's how I close the window. Meanwhile, if it clicks it, it pops up another box saying, are you sure you want to do this? Yes or no. And both of those are the wrong answer. This is one of those issues that we have to understand, that when that happens, that is helping to erode the trust of the user, because they don't know what to trust. And as security practitioners, we have to put the tools in place so they can learn how to better trust. Next slide, please. So this is a great example from my friend Cory Doctorow's Twitter feed, where he took a screenshot of an ad that popped up in his feed. And if you look there in the yellow circle, you'll see a little what looks like a smudge. And he went to wipe it and he thought it was on his screen. It turned out that was actually in the image itself, which erroneously got the individual to click on the ad, which is not something they would have otherwise done. Next slide, please. So the attackers know this, and they know how to prey on what would our sensibilities. What we would normally do, they can mess with us in many ways. They can do bait and switch. They do confirm shaming, like the box that pops up saying, are you really sure you want to do that? Misdirection, and trick questions and things like that. where you're causing them to make choices that, by all rights, they wouldn't normally make. Next slide, please. Another example of this is messing with colors on or tick boxes and things like that. There was one application that I was working on just 2 days ago. And when I went to click on the button to enable a particular function in the application, because there was a bug in it, it would actually move the little checkbox to the left. And I was like, okay, that's different. So I go over to click the box again, and it would go back to the right. And this was the most insidious pain in the posterior that I could think of. And it really caused me a great deal of frustration, but this was just a mistake in the code. And I was able to figure out what was going on. But that sort of behavior is something the attackers will use in their malicious attempts to gain access to your system, to steal your data. And this really does create anxiety for the user because, let's be honest, the vast majority of users that are working remotely or on computers in general are not necessarily technically savvy. They know how to open Excel. They know how to open their email. They know how to get things done for their job. But if you ask them to, switch from an Ethernet cable to a Wi-Fi or whatever it happens to be, something what we would take as being simple, this could cause them a great deal of angst. And we have to always be cognizant of this, that we are there to enable them to get their jobs done. The goal really is quite simple. We want to make sure that security is done in a way that doesn't fracture their best interest. Next slide, please. So malicious design is something that comes up a lot. And unfortunately, a lot of times only a designer will actually be able to spot this sort of behavior. And when we have things like that, and then we contrast that against applications that are written by engineers for engineers, this makes it very, very difficult for the end user to be able to use their applications. Lotus. Sorry, flashback to my earlier days. And when they can't figure out something because it is far too difficult to use, they may make mistakes. And the same can be said of malicious design, in that people will make mistakes that they wouldn't be able to discern what was going on. Next slide, please. What it fundamentally boils down to is we aren't able to trust ourselves to make the right decisions many times. And that's not because we don't get it. It's because we are built to trust. We are expecting things to work a certain way. And unfortunately, nefarious types will prey on that. Next slide, please. Because we all have some sort of bias. No matter how we put it, we all have our individual biases. And we have to make sure that those biases are not causing us or others undue harm. We always have to be cognizant of this, because not only does that affect the individuals who are interacting with their systems, but we also have to look at how bias negatively impacts technology. Next slide, please. So here is an absolute fantastic example. Ahmed El-Zari was talking about creating a bug bounty for bad algorithms. That's an excellent idea. And this is the kind of thing that we have to start looking at. I was very fortunate to see a talk by Mikko Hyppinen, and sorry, Mikko, if I got your name pronounced wrong, who gave a talk a couple of years ago when we were able to go out in public. And he was talking about applications that were writing other applications. And this was really amazing. But if the initial application has a negative bias built into it, that can then replicate and change in various nefarious ways as it goes along. We need to be able to better understand how we are affecting our environments around us. And this very much extends to algorithms. Next slide, please. So we have to really pay attention to the capabilities that we are trying to do, because we don't want to have negative impacts as we go along. Because yes, we do security, but imagine we put on a different hat. Imagine we went into a different role. Next slide, please. Now, here's a story from 2011 about a former security expert that became, security expert, who went in to become a developer and started his own application. And one of the things that he found out rather short order, that everything he had been talking about from a security perspective, when it came down to writing his own application, he ended up, making the same mistakes. Next slide, please. And there's other things that we have to look at on how attackers can cause us trouble. And one is the subtlety of corrupting data. Now, we always worry about data being stolen or data being compromised in some fashion, but we don't tend to spend a lot of time on data being altered. Now, this is a great example here where emails that were leaked ostensibly were tied back to this particular journalist, and it's made it look like he was talking to the CIA, as an example, in the United States. This wasn't the case, but this was an example of what looked like a data breach turned out to be actually just absolutely false flag. And these are the kind of things that we always have to be on the lookout, because this could really change the narrative with just a few short words. Next slide, please. Here's another example here where a story was changed where it absolutely altered the meaning by just changing a few words in the text. This is the kind of thing where trust, again, is further eroded. Next slide, please. Sorry. We have to be able to defend against denial of trust attacks. And these are attacks against things that we expect to be correct, be it a user interface, be it data, be it how an application should be behaving. We have to be always aware of this, because we have a fiduciary responsibility to protect our organizations, to protect our staff and our data. And if we are not there to enable them to do things safely and securely, then unfortunately, this is going to have unfortunate consequences. Next up. So in order for us to trust in ourselves, we have to learn how to earn trust from others. Now, there's been a lot of conversation over the years about what exactly trust is. And a lot of times it is like, oh, I just trust them. Well, have you earned it? Have you verified it? Have you gone through and said, yes, this is okay? If you log into an application with a username and password, does that mean you are trusted to use that application? That just means you had the house key. So we have to look at doing a more, concerted effort to secure those devices, secure those applications, and protect the data. Next slide, please. And we're able to do that by earning trust through various steps, being honest with folks. When things go wrong, coming out and saying clearly that this is what happened, our particular system was breached for X, Y, and Z, and this is what happened, and these are the steps we're taking to remediate it. Trying to pretend something didn't happen or being disingenuous with the information, again, further erodes the trust in your customers and whatever it happens to be. We have to be transparent. We have to make sure that we are the adults in the room as security practitioners, as security professionals, because we need to establish that trust. In the past, we may have had the concept of, yes, we are the flaming sword of justice. How do we get to the answer of no? That's a deprecated notion. We have to show predictability. We have to show capability and a willingness to correct mistakes when we make them. I've built a career on making mistakes as I've gone along, and I've learned from them. So the key is mistakes are okay as long as you learn from them, as long as you're able to share those stories with others so that they won't make the same mistakes as well. Because we have an accountability not only to ourselves, to our organizations, but the security community at large, and by extension, everybody else. Next slide, please. Remember when Microsoft said they were going to do trustworthy computing and everybody sort of jumped up and down and said, nah, it's not going to happen. They did it. They did a really good job. Security for that particular organization has absolutely improved. But how do we extend that beyond that to the wider audience? Next slide, please. Is zero trust one of those answers? Now, this is a term that usually gets a lot of blowback, as it were, because of negative connotations, because people say, oh, it's just a marketing term. All right, let's flip it on its head. Let's call it continuous trusted access. Makes sense. Same thing. The whole idea here is about reducing risk in the organization. Next slide, please. So, is it the right choice? Yes and no. There is a case to be made for the maturity of the organization to understand what it is they're trying to protect. Also understand where they are on the roadmap for talking about continuous trusted access and how they're going to get to a better place, because they're working very hard to protect the workplace, the workforce, and the workload. And when we're doing this, we have to realize that while we may have erosion of trust with the users, that we can help establish that and moving forward. And is it easy? No. Is it for everybody? In certain respects, yeah, because this is about reducing risk. It's really that simple. We can go into talking about microzone segmentation, talking about all these different aspects of it. But the reality is it's really about getting back to core fundamentals and tackling things that we should have been doing a long time ago. User management, device management, application control, as well as network zone segmentation. These are just some of the examples. Next slide, please. Because when we're born into this world, we are, crying, we're hungry, we're scared, we're looking to be safe. We're looking for shelter, we're looking to eat. And Malcolm Gladwell talked about this in his book, Talking to Strangers, about how we default to trust. Unfortunately, that does not translate as we grow up, as we get into computer systems, computer networks, and all the rest of it, because it just isn't something that translates one-to-one. There is no lift and shift for trust. We have to make sure that we are working very hard to establish controls and put in place that will enable people to get their business done safely and securely and establish that trust and maintain it. Next slide, please. Always got to work in the breaks. Next slide, please. We have to move away from some of our deprecated notions of how we saw security overall. So in the past, it was like, we have a firewall, everything's fine, nothing to see here. I actually worked in one organization many, many years ago, I think it was over 15 years ago, where the CIO looked at me and said, it's okay, we trust everyone's here, we have a firewall. After that particular meeting, which was reviewing the findings for a penetration test, we realized very quickly that that was not something that was going to hold up. Next slide, please. Now, when we're talking about trust, we could say granting access without verifying. Say username and password, that isn't really trust. We could say trust is granted because you've been verified. One of those makes more sense. We need to be able to be sure that the people that are connecting to our systems are the ones that are in fact supposed to be there. Another company I worked at years ago, we had various programmers in a country overseas that were doing code for us. And they would come into our network and they would do their stuff, and nothing ever bad happened. But my coworker said, have we ever, checked to see how things are going there? I'd been on the job for 4 days. I said, I had no idea, but I'll check. So we found out in rather short order that people were coming in from this country, all over the different parts of the country, accessing our network and doing their jobs, which was fine. The problem was they were using the same key fob for all these people that were separated by, very long drives. So there was no way that they were, sharing that particular token other than calling in and getting someone to read the next number off to them to access the system. They weren't doing this out of a sense of malice. They were doing this to get their job done. And when we dug into it, we found out that the mistake was ours, because at no point in our contractual language had we spelled out that they needed to do various security steps that we were specifying, because we didn't specify them. And that was a real problem. So we have to make sure that we are building in an understanding as to what our requirements are across the board, because things are going to cause trouble if they are not clearly defined. And that trust will tend to erode over time. Next slide, please. And there's different types of attacks. Like I was talking about earlier, the fake news. I hate that term, but it's here to stay. In various types of forms. There are people that are putting it out there just to make their point, or putting it out there to further a conspiracy theory, or governments trying to influence a populace to vote a certain way. Data misuse is another example, and data breaches are something that constantly causes trouble. I started paying attention to these back in about 2012, and I started tracking these, and to nowhere near to what Troy does now. Kudos to him. But when we're going through and looking at those data breaches, they were pretty small back then. Now they're in orders of magnitude of billions of records, and they're happening over and over again. And this doesn't have to be this way. Next slide. So how can all of this become an attack against the system? Next slide, please. One great example of this is integrity attacks, subtle or overt corruption of data. I talked about that a little bit earlier with those particular stories, but if somebody's able to go in and change the spreadsheet for a financial report to say, their accounts receivable were X instead of Y, and then they had their earnings announcement the next day, That could have a real horrible effect. Or accusing somebody of a data breach by dumping a whole lot of passwords on the internet and saying they were hacked. And it turns out that it was just a whole bunch of different data breaches that were all stitched together and made to look that way. In the meantime, it had negatively impacted the stock price of that particular company. There's many different ways to look at this. So when we're talking about securing all of this, we have to tackle, 3 core tenets. Next slide, please. We have to look at securing the users, the devices, and the applications. It really is the core fundamentals. Next slide, please. Because our ecosystem has spread. The idea of the castle wall and the moat, we've all seen the castle image on network diagrams over the years. This is something we need to do away with because that really isn't the way things are anymore. The perimeter is anywhere an access decision is being made. And we have, third-party contractors coming in. We have partner systems. We have various applications that are facing the internet that may or may not have been through proper security vetting. These are all different things that really have to have a framework overlaid to reduce the risk. Next slide, please. So zero trust or continuous trusted access is a great example of this. Here's a quick 5-step walkthrough on how we could tackle this. First of all, you want to establish trust in the users. Do you know the users that are in your environment? Are they the ones that are supposed to be there? Do you have a manual staff add remove process, or is it automated? Then the next step from there is you want to gain visibility into the devices and activity and what is it they're doing. Is this Dave sitting at a Tim Hortons in Toronto, Canada, or am I sitting on the beach in the Gold Coast and causing trouble from there? Like, these are the kind of things we really have to have some method to verify. Next up, you want to ensure the trustworthiness of the devices. So is it patched to current? Is it past to current or N-1? What is the risk appetite for your organization that you've set out in advance? If it hasn't been patched in 30 days, you have the ability to say, okay, you can't come in until you address these particular issues. And then being able to place, adaptive policies over top of that, saying, oh, you're in finance, you get these systems. You're in IT, you get access to these systems. And ne'er the twain shall meet, or whatever your issues are within your own organization. And that fundamentally will take us to talking about a zero trust or continuous trusted access framework, which is all about reducing risk. And this is definitely something that we can do because we have to implement best practices. Next slide, please. We have to look at verifying the users, verifying their devices, and protecting every application. That may seem overly simplistic, but it really does tackle the lion's share of what we have to contend with. Next slide, please. Because if you've seen the DBIR report that came out today, there is a great example of, a higher 80+% of the attacks were involving, human interaction or stolen credentials. There was a high number of organized crime statistics in there as well. And when we're looking at this and looking at stolen credentials, this is the stock and trade of the attackers. If they're able to get usernames and passwords from a third-party website and use that to attack another website and then escalate their access, that's a problem. So if we can remove that by adding in another factor, having multi-factor authentication is a great example of this, we can remove the attacker's ability to really cause harm. Yes, there would be a reputational risk of having username and password exposed, but they wouldn't be able to do any real damage beyond that. Next slide, please. And we have to be able to enforce the systems that have, poor security hygiene in a way that they are not going to get in. Like in the past, when I used to be able to travel, I would be in a hotel and I hadn't been on the road for a month. I go to log in, it's like, oh, you have to patch this before you can get in. It's like, all right, cool. A victim of my own design here. But these are the things we have to constantly be vigilant about because, next slide, please, we are always constantly trying to make sure we're protecting the workplace, the workforce, and the workload. That really does take all the aspects of our business into different buckets. Next slide, please. So user trust. You see some repetition here. User trust. We need to make sure we know who the people are that are attaching to our systems. Who are the ones that are in our network? Is it somebody just happen to have a password or somebody that we truly know who they are? Next slide, please. We have to be able to do discovery of our network, discovery of our assets and applications to understand what it is that we're taking the time to protect. Next slide, please. Want to be able to verify, is it a trusted endpoint? Is it something that we know is part of our corporate asset inventory? Or is it a BYOD device that we have previously seen or we've approved to gain access to the network? These are things that we need to be able to check. Or is it something that's untrusted? Like in a previous job that I did years ago, I was able to VPN into our company using a web browser on an old first-gen Xbox One, or Xbox rather, and I was able to check my email. I did that only because I wanted to see if it was possible. This happened on a Sunday. I got into work on Monday and nobody said anything. That was extremely troubling. Nobody had noticed that I had done this. So I came clean and they were very upset about it and they wanted my head on a stick. But this really spoke more to the fact that we needed that endpoint visibility to understand what it was that was attaching to our systems. Next slide, please. We have to be sure that those devices that are coming in are the ones that are supposed to be there. We don't need old Xboxes, or we don't need systems running Windows ME, which for whatever reason, I saw one go to my own personal website about a month ago. I don't know if somebody was trolling me or they really were using that system. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, there's. And security debt is a great example of things we have to be aware of, because when we're dealing with, establishing trust in the users and the systems and the data, if we are using systems that have not been patched in years, like you have an OS2 warp system that's running your HVAC system and it hasn't been rebooted in 7 years. I've seen that before. These are the kind of things we have to be aware of, because the attackers will look for these sort of really weird systems. Or if it's something that hasn't been patched in several months, but there's a known vulnerability in the wild, we're really doing ourselves a disservice by not addressing that in a timely fashion. Next slide, please. Adaptive policies. We need to be able to go through and apply policies that make sense. Are you from business unit A, B, or C? You get the policy that works for you. So when they try to access systems that they should have no business going into, then you're able to control that and be able to alert on that as well. Next slide, please. Now, from a policy perspective, you can do all manner of things. I mean, there is, geo-blocking, which only has limited utility because, the attackers can then move through another system. You can't get me on behind 7 proxies. But you can also set what level of hygiene you're expecting systems to come in that are going to have, what sort of flexibility for the hours of work or where they're coming from, and some grace periods. So if they're able to get into the system or there's something wrong and they lock themselves out, you say, okay, you're locked out for this amount of time, then we'll try again. And this gives the responders a chance to look at the system and say, okay, maybe not everything is entirely up to snuff here. Next slide, please. We want to be able to protect every application in our organization. Are you using Office 365 or using G Suite or whatever it happens to be? There's no reason that somebody in New Zealand or Thailand or Canada should be accessing your network if they don't work for you. So why would you not have them go through a reverse proxy in order for them to access the system? So you have them go to a reverse proxy, authenticate, and then be able to access the systems rather than going to them directly. This is, again, about limiting risk in your organization. We can do better. Next slide, please. And when we look at this, we realize that as we move towards a risk reduction framework, as we move to continuous trusted access, we're verifying all the users, the devices, and the applications in our environment. And we're ostensibly getting a little bit closer to having that jetpack that has really eluded us for a very long time, or at least me anyway. Next slide, please. We have to talk about the ephemeral nature of trust. It's neither binary, it's neither permanent, but it has to be constantly revisited and constantly verified. So when we're doing this, we have to do it in a way that's enabling the users to get their jobs done, to understand the process, and democratize security by making it easy as possible for them to do things without negatively impacting them. What conditions need to be true in order for them to gain access to the system, and how long are they allowed to be able to come in? How long are you allowing that trust to be in effect? You say, yes, you're good for the next hour, you're good for the next 18 hours. That's really something that is germane to the conversation about risk within your own organization. Next slide, please. So what happens in a community without trust? I think we all know that. If we don't have trust, the community falls apart. What happens about a society without trust? The society falls apart. not a good place to be. Next slide, please. Revisiting this from earlier, we establish trust with honesty, transparency, predictability, capability, willingness to correct the mistakes we've made, and accountability to ourselves as well as to our organizations and the wider audience overall. Next slide, please. And we're able to do this by having prevention, detection, and correction, having the right tools in place. After you've done your homework, you've looked at all the assets in your environment, the users, the devices, the applications, the systems, the networks. Once you understand that, then you can have the conversation about tools. Next slide, please. We have to make sure that we are able to have trustworthy data and trustworthy systems. And we have to make it in such a way that they cannot be separated from trustworthy people. We don't want to negatively influence how things are going to happen, how they're going to roll out, because we missed a step, because we didn't do our job, because we missed a patch. It's a constant battle, but we have to understand that mistakes are going to be made. Next slide, please. And, mistakes happen all the time. We have to understand that what may seem like a small mistake could have a horrible knock-on effect. Next slide, please. So as we're getting further along the conversation of talking about continuous trust access, of talking about reducing risk on our environments, we realize that we're getting a little bit closer to that dream of having a personal jetpack. Maybe I'll be able to expense one day, and be able to have that future that we were promised all those many moons ago. I would like to thank everyone for being here today. I really do appreciate the chance to be here, if only as a giant floating head on your screen. And thank you once again. I really appreciate your time today. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. If you want, drop me an email or follow me on the Twitters. And I hope you have a great rest of your conference today.
Hopefully you can hear the clapping. Thank you very much. Anyone else lodged any questions on the app? If you have, let me know, because I can only see the one that I lodged on the app. And I just thought I'd throw this one at you as a sort of side issue. How do you feel about one identity to sort of rule them all? And I'm talking about identity, not directory here. So based on real world ID or something, because governments like you to have one ID. So that feeling of one identity versus having many identities, like a government one, a corporate one, a social one, do you see that one is safer than many, or do you see it the other way, or is there some other ground in there?
Okay, so we here in Canada, we do have something similar about that sort of subject, where they're talking about creating this sort of digital identification. Where I lean more to it is, if that is going to be created, it should be controlled by the user themselves. I don't believe that the government should be the ones controlling that particular identification. Oh, that's my echo. So we want to make sure that we are giving them the ability to control that. And I wrote a paper about it at school where I was using DNA as part of the marker for the key. There are different ways to do it, and that's just it. We want to make sure that the key belongs to that person, cannot be taken from that person, and they have the ability to revoke it if they need to. That's just my personal bent.
Yeah, cool. Well, that makes sense. I like the DNA comment you made there. I mean, that one you can change, but it just takes lots of time and mutation that you don't necessarily want. But anyway,
yeah, well, true.
Thank you very much for your talk. And we'll see you some other time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.